Public executions. The summer of 1946 was a period marked by the world's desperate attempt to grapple with the aftermath of World War II. In the air hung a heavy sense of responsibility. Nations, communities, and individuals alike were searching for justice, closure, and a way to move forward. On July 4th of that year, a date chosen with a symbolism that echoed the pursuit of freedom, a staggering 200,000 people gathered in the city of Gdańsk, Poland, at a place forever scarred by the horrors of war, Stutthof. This location, once a Nazi concentration camp, was now transformed into a stage for one of the most significant public executions in the history of post-war Europe. The guards of Stutthof, who had terrorized and brutalized thousands during the war, were about to face the ultimate judgment in front of an audience whose sheer size spoke volumes about the magnitude of their crimes. Public executions are a macabre form of justice, where the act of punishment is not only administered but also witnessed by the masses, creating a collective experience of retribution. The execution of the guards at Stutthof was not a private, behind-closed-doors affair. It was a public spectacle, intended to send a message far beyond the immediate circle of the condemned and their victims. The decision to make these executions public was rooted in a deep-seated need to provide a sense of closure to the survivors, to the families of the victims, and to a world that was still reeling from the unprecedented horrors of the Holocaust. These executions were more than a legal obligation. They were a symbolic act, a necessary step in the healing process of a deeply wounded society. The crowd that assembled that day was diverse, encompassing survivors of the camp, local citizens, members of the Allied forces, and even international observers who had come to witness this moment of reckoning. The size of the crowd was staggering. 200,000 people. Imagine the logistics of such a gathering. The roads clogged with people coming from all directions, the murmur of voices as they approached the site, the air thick with anticipation. The crowd was a living, breathing testament to the importance of this event. Each person present represented a broader community that had been affected by the war, and each had come to bear witness to the final chapter in a story that had brought so much pain and suffering. As the crowd gathered, the atmosphere was electric, charged with a mix of emotions: anger, sorrow, anticipation, and perhaps, for some, a sense of grim satisfaction. There was a palpable tension in the air, as if the collective weight of history itself bore down upon the gathering. The executions were not just a form of punishment. They were a performance of justice, a ritualistic act designed to restore some semblance of order to a world that had been thrown into chaos. The sheer number of spectators underscored the public and symbolic nature of these executions. It was as if the world itself had gathered to bear witness, to ensure that justice was not only done but seen to be done. For those who had survived the horrors of Stutthof, the executions were an opportunity to confront their tormentors, to see them stripped of their power and brought low before the judgment of the people. The camp guards, once the embodiment of terror and cruelty, now stood before the gallows as mere mortals, awaiting their fate. The reversal of roles was stark. Those who had once wielded life and death over others now faced their own mortality, their fate sealed by the very people they had once oppressed. The public nature of these executions was a critical component of their impact. The presence of such a large crowd ensured that the event would be etched into the collective memory of those who witnessed it. It was a moment that would be recounted and remembered, not just by those present, but by future generations as well. The executions at Stutthof were more than just a judicial act. They were a communal experience, a way for society to come to terms with the atrocities that had been committed and to reaffirm its commitment to justice and the rule of law. The gallows themselves, towering structures that dominated the landscape, were a grim reminder of the fate that awaited those who committed unspeakable acts in the name of ideology. These gallows were not hastily constructed. They were built with the intention of making a statement. They stood as symbols of retribution, their height and prominence ensuring that no one in the crowd could miss the significance of what was about to take place. The guards of Stutthof, who had once loomed large over their prisoners, now found themselves dwarfed by the very structures that would bring about their end. The decision to hold the executions at Stutthof was also deeply symbolic. This was a place that had been the site of so much suffering, a place where the boundaries of humanity had been tested and often found wanting. By conducting the executions here, the Allies were not just punishing the guilty. They were reclaiming the space, transforming it from a place of death and despair into a place of justice and reckoning. The executions served as a way to exorcise the ghosts of the past, to lay to rest the spirits of those who had perished here by ensuring that their killers would not escape unpunished. The presence of 200,000 people was a powerful statement in and of itself. It was as if the entire world had converged on this spot to bear witness to the final judgment of those who had caused so much pain and suffering. The size of the crowd reflected the global significance of the event. These were not just local criminals being punished for local crimes. These were individuals who had participated in a global atrocity, and their punishment was a global event. The executions were a reminder that the crimes of the Holocaust were not just crimes against individual victims or specific communities. They were crimes against humanity as a whole. The public nature of the executions also served as a form of deterrence. By making the executions a public spectacle, the Allies were sending a clear message to the world. Those who commit such heinous acts will be held accountable, and their punishment will be severe. The sight of the guards standing on the gallows, waiting for the moment when the trapdoor would open beneath them, was a powerful reminder of the consequences of participating in such atrocities. It was a warning to anyone who might be tempted to follow in their footsteps, a reminder that the world was watching, and that justice would be served. For the survivors of Stutthof and their families, the executions were a form of closure. The sight of their former tormentors brought low, stripped of their power and facing their final judgment, provided a sense of justice that no trial or sentence could ever fully convey. The executions were a way for the survivors to reclaim their own sense of agency, to see that those who had wronged them would not go unpunished. It was a way for them to confront their past and begin the process of healing, knowing that the people who had caused them so much pain were finally being held accountable. The atmosphere at the executions was one of somber reflection, but also of resolve. The crowd had come not just to witness the punishment of the guilty, but to reaffirm their commitment to the principles of justice and the rule of law. The executions were a powerful reminder of the importance of these principles, and of the need to uphold them in the face of even the most heinous crimes. The presence of 200,000 people at Stutthof was a testament to the enduring power of these principles, and to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering. In many ways, the executions at Stutthof were a microcosm of the broader process of post-war justice. They represented a turning point in the world's efforts to come to terms with the atrocities of the Holocaust and to ensure that such horrors would never be repeated. The executions were a way for the world to collectively say, "Never again," and to commit itself to the pursuit of justice, no matter how difficult or painful that pursuit might be. The public nature of the executions was a crucial part of this process, ensuring that the lessons of the past would not be forgotten, and that the crimes of the Holocaust would be remembered and condemned for generations to come. As the gallows were prepared and the guards led to their fate, the crowd watched in silence, the weight of history pressing down upon them. This was not just the end of a group of individuals. It was the end of an era, a final act of justice for the victims of Stutthof and a symbol of hope for a world that was still struggling to rebuild itself in the aftermath of war. The executions were a powerful reminder of the importance of justice, and of the need to hold those who commit atrocities accountable for their actions. They were a moment of reckoning, not just for the guards of Stutthof, but for the world as a whole. The decision to hold the executions publicly, in front of such a large crowd, ensured that the event would be etched into the collective memory of those who witnessed it. It was a moment that would be recounted and remembered, not just by those present, but by future generations as well. The executions at Stutthof were more than just a judicial act. They were a communal experience, a way for society to come to terms with the atrocities that had been committed and to reaffirm its commitment to justice and the rule of law. The day of the executions was one of both closure and resolve. As the gallows loomed large over the crowd, the atmosphere was one of solemn reflection, but also of determination. The crowd had come not just to witness the punishment of the guilty, but to reaffirm their commitment to the principles of justice and the rule of law. The executions were a powerful reminder of the importance of these principles, and of the need to uphold them, even in the face of unimaginable evil. The sight of the guards, once symbols of unchecked power and cruelty, now facing their final judgment on the gallows, served as a stark contrast to the world that had allowed such atrocities to occur. It was a moment that crystallized the global resolve to ensure that such horrors would never happen again. As the executions began, the atmosphere shifted. The crowd, once a sea of murmurs and anticipation, fell into a tense, almost eerie silence. The only sounds were the creaking of the gallows and the distant cries of the condemned. For many in the crowd, this was not just a moment of retribution but a moment of reckoning, a chance to see justice served for the horrors they had either witnessed or suffered through. The gallows stood as a symbol, not just of punishment, but of the collective need for justice, for accountability, and for closure. The execution of Jenny Wanda Barkman, known as the Beautiful Spectre of Stutthof, was particularly significant. Barkman, one of the female guards, had become infamous for her cruelty during her time at the camp. Her execution, along with those of other female guards, was a stark reminder that the atrocities of the Holocaust were not committed by faceless bureaucrats alone, but by individuals who made conscious choices to participate in and perpetuate the horrors. Her execution on the gallows of Biskupia Gorka was a powerful moment, one that highlighted the role of women in the machinery of the Holocaust and underscored the importance of holding all perpetrators accountable, regardless of gender. The method of execution, slow strangulation, was particularly brutal. This was not a quick, merciful end. It was a prolonged, agonizing death that could take up to 20 minutes. For the crowd, this was a deliberate choice, a way to ensure that the punishment fit the crime. The guards had inflicted untold suffering on their victims, and now they would experience a small measure of that suffering in their final moments. The choice of this method was symbolic, a way of making the condemned feel the weight of their actions as they faced their own mortality. For the spectators, it was a grim reminder of the brutality that had been unleashed during the war, and a sobering reflection on the nature of justice and retribution. As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere grew heavier, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. The slow, deliberate nature of the executions served to heighten the tension, each movement of the condemned drawing the crowd further into the grim reality of what was unfolding. This was not just a spectacle of death, it was a spectacle of justice, a public reaffirmation of the world's commitment to holding those responsible for the Holocaust accountable. The executions were a form of catharsis, a way for the world to exorcise the demons of the past and move forward, albeit with the scars of history still fresh. The significance of these executions extended far beyond the immediate act of punishment. They were a message to the world, a declaration that justice would be served, no matter how difficult or painful that process might be. The public nature of the executions ensured that they would not be forgotten, that the lessons of the past would be carried forward into the future. The executions were a way of ensuring that the crimes of the Holocaust would never be repeated, that the world would remember and learn from its darkest hours. For the survivors of Stutthof, the executions were a moment of vindication, a final act of justice for the horrors they had endured. The sight of their former tormentors brought low, stripped of their power and facing their final judgment, provided a sense of closure that no trial or sentence could ever fully convey. The executions were a way for the survivors to reclaim their own sense of agency, to see that those who had wronged them would not go unpunished. It was a way for them to confront their past and begin the process of healing, knowing that the people who had caused them so much pain were finally being held accountable. The crowd that gathered to witness the executions was a diverse one, drawn from all walks of life, but united by a common desire to see justice done. For many, this was a deeply personal moment, a chance to bear witness to the final chapter in a story that had brought so much pain and suffering. The presence of 200,000 people was a testament to the global significance of the event, a reflection of the world's collective desire to ensure that the crimes of the Holocaust would not go unpunished. As the last of the condemned guards breathed their final breaths, the crowd began to disperse, the atmosphere one of somber reflection. The executions were over, but the memory of what had taken place would linger, etched into the collective consciousness of those who had witnessed it. The gallows at Stutthof had served their purpose, delivering justice to those who had perpetrated some of the worst crimes in human history. But the real significance of the event lay in what it represented: a commitment to justice, to accountability, and to the memory of those who had suffered and died at the hands of the Nazi regime. The executions at Stutthof were a turning point in the process of post-war justice. They were a powerful reminder of the importance of holding those responsible for the Holocaust accountable for their actions, and of the need to ensure that such atrocities would never be repeated. The public nature of the executions ensured that they would be remembered, not just as a moment of retribution, but as a moment of collective reckoning, a way for the world to come to terms with the horrors of the past and to commit itself to a future where justice would prevail. The day of the executions marked the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in the world's efforts to come to terms with the Holocaust. The executions were a way for the world to say, "Never again," and to commit itself to the pursuit of justice, no matter how difficult or painful that pursuit might be. The public nature of the executions was a crucial part of this process, ensuring that the lessons of the past would not be forgotten, and that the crimes of the Holocaust would be remembered and condemned for generations to come. As the gallows at Stutthof were dismantled and the crowd dispersed, the memory of what had taken place there lingered. The executions were over, but their significance would endure, a powerful reminder of the importance of justice and the need to hold those who commit atrocities accountable for their actions. The executions at Stutthof were more than just a judicial act. They were a communal experience, a way for society to come to terms with the atrocities that had been committed and to reaffirm its commitment to justice and the rule of law. The legacy of the executions at Stutthof lives on, not just in the memory of those who were present that day, but in the broader history of post-war justice. They serve as a reminder of the importance of accountability, of the need to confront the past and to ensure that the crimes of the Holocaust are never forgotten. The executions were a moment of reckoning, not just for the guards of Stutthof, but for the world as a whole. A moment when justice was served, and the memory of those who had suffered and died was honored in the most public way possible. The gallows structure. In the heart of Stutthof, on that fateful day of July 4, 1946, the gallows that had been erected stood as more than just tools of execution. They were monumental symbols of retribution and justice. These gallows were not hastily constructed, but rather meticulously designed to convey a powerful message to the 200,000 people who had gathered to witness the event. The towering structures, looming over the crowd, were a stark reminder of the power dynamics that had once ruled this desolate place. Power that was now being reversed in a most public and definitive manner. The height and scale of the gallows ensured that no one in attendance would miss the significance of what was about to unfold. They were designed to be seen from every corner of the crowd, transforming the execution site into a stage where justice would be meted out in a spectacle that was both grim and necessary. The construction of these gallows was a deliberate act, infused with symbolism at every turn. Unlike the simple, utilitarian structures often seen in public executions throughout history, these gallows were grand in scale, meant to dominate the landscape and command attention. The very wood used in their construction carried weight, perhaps even the souls of those who had perished within the camp's confines. The choice of materials and the towering height of the gallows were meant to remind the onlookers of the cold, unyielding nature of justice that was about to be served. Every nail driven into the wood, every rope tied to its beam, was a statement of finality and retribution. The structures themselves seemed to embody the very essence of the punishment about to be delivered, standing as ominous sentinels over a crowd that had come to see the end of an era. The decision to construct 5 separate gallows was not merely a practical solution to the logistical challenges of executing multiple individuals. It was a symbolic gesture, underscoring the collective nature of the crimes that had been committed. Each gallows represented a different facet of the atrocities that had taken place at Stutthof, a different segment of the machinery of death that the Nazis had so ruthlessly operated. By executing several guards simultaneously, the message was clear. These crimes were not the actions of isolated individuals, but the result of a coordinated, systematic effort to exterminate and oppress. The sight of multiple gallows standing side by side was a powerful visual metaphor for the scale of the Holocaust itself, vast, interconnected, and devastating in its reach. As the gallows were prepared for the day's grim proceedings, the atmosphere in the camp was heavy with anticipation. The sheer scale of the structures, combined with their number, created a sense of inevitability, a feeling that justice long delayed was finally about to be served. For the crowd, many of whom were survivors or relatives of the victims, the sight of the gallows brought a complex mix of emotions: anger, sorrow, and perhaps a sense of vindication. The gallows were not just a means to an end. They were a manifestation of the desire for justice that had burned in the hearts of so many for so long. The very act of constructing these gallows was a form of catharsis, a way of channeling the collective rage and grief of the survivors into a tangible symbol of retribution. The height of the gallows was a crucial element in their design. Standing tall above the crowd, they ensured that the executions would be visible to everyone, no matter where they stood. This was not just about practicality. It was about making a statement. The authorities wanted to ensure that the condemned could not hide from their fate, nor could the crowd be denied the sight of justice being done. The elevation of the gallows also served a symbolic purpose, placing the condemned literally above the crowd in their final moments, a stark inversion of the power dynamics that had once defined their relationship with their victims. Now, it was the condemned who were on display, their lives hanging by a thread, quite literally, while the crowd below watched, silent and solemn. The very act of climbing the gallows was fraught with symbolism. For the condemned guards, it was a final, humiliating reversal of fortune. These were men and women who had once lorded over their prisoners with impunity, who had exercised the power of life and death over thousands. Now, they were forced to ascend the steps of the gallows, each step bringing them closer to the ultimate judgment. The sight of these once feared figures being led up to the gallows was a potent reminder of the fragility of power, and of the fact that even the most ruthless oppressors could not escape the reach of justice. The crowd watched as the condemned were brought up, their every movement scrutinized by thousands of eyes, a final, public stripping of their authority and dignity. The simultaneous use of 5 gallows was a logistical necessity, given the number of executions that needed to be carried out. But it was also a deliberate choice that reinforced the scale of the event. The authorities could have chosen to execute the guards one by one, drawing out the process over hours or even days. But by executing them in groups, they underscored the fact that these individuals were not being punished in isolation. They were part of a larger network of perpetrators who had carried out their crimes together. The sight of multiple executions happening at once was a powerful reminder of the interconnectedness of the Nazi regime's atrocities, and of the collective responsibility borne by those who had participated in it. For the crowd, the sight of the 5 gallows, each with its own set of condemned prisoners, was both mesmerizing and horrifying. The scale of the event was almost too much to take in at once. The sheer number of executions, the size of the structures, the enormity of the crimes that had led to this moment. It was a spectacle in the truest sense of the word, one that demanded the full attention of everyone present. The gallows dominated the landscape, their towering forms casting long shadows over the crowd as the sun began to set. The image of the 5 gallows standing side by side, each one ready to deliver justice, was one that would be seared into the memories of those who witnessed it, a visual representation of the scale and severity of the Holocaust, and of the determination of the world to hold those responsible accountable. As the executions began, the crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on the gallows. The structures, so carefully constructed and designed to dominate the scene, now took on a life of their own. The creaking of the wood, the tightening of the ropes, the final, desperate struggles of the condemned. All of these sounds and sights were amplified by the scale of the gallows and the number of executions taking place. The gallows, which had loomed so ominously over the crowd, now fulfilled their purpose with a grim finality. Each execution was a reminder of the crimes that had been committed, and of the fact that justice, though delayed, would ultimately be served. The significance of the gallows extended far beyond their physical presence. They were a symbol of the world's commitment to justice, a tangible representation of the determination to ensure that the atrocities of the Holocaust would not go unpunished. The very act of building and using the gallows was a way of reclaiming the space of Stutthof, transforming it from a place of death and despair into a place of justice and accountability. The gallows stood as a reminder that the crimes of the past could not be erased, but they could be confronted and punished in a way that honored the memory of the victims and ensured that their suffering would not be forgotten. In the end, the gallows at Stutthof were more than just instruments of execution. They were symbols of a broader reckoning, a moment when the world came together to confront the horrors of the past and to ensure that justice would be done. The structures themselves, with their towering height and multiple platforms, were a testament to the scale of the atrocities that had been committed, and to the determination of the world to hold those responsible accountable. The gallows were a powerful reminder that justice is not just about punishing the guilty, but about making a statement to the world, a statement that the crimes of the past will not be forgotten, and that those who commit them will be held to account. As the final executions were carried out and the gallows stood empty, the crowd slowly began to disperse, their minds filled with the gravity of what they had witnessed. The gallows, now silent and still, loomed over the empty field, their presence a stark reminder of the day's events. For those who had come to witness the executions, the gallows would remain etched in their memories, a symbol of the justice that had been served and the lives that had been lost. The structures, once so full of life and death, now stood as silent sentinels, their purpose fulfilled, their message clear. The world had come to Stutthof to bear witness to justice, and the gallows had been the instrument through which that justice was delivered. In the years that followed, the gallows at Stutthof would come to be remembered not just as the site of executions, but as a symbol of the world's resolve to confront the horrors of the past and to ensure that justice would be done. The structures themselves may have been dismantled, but their legacy lives on, a powerful reminder of the importance of accountability and of the need to remember and honor the victims of the Holocaust. The gallows, with their towering height and multiple platforms, were a testament to the scale of the atrocities that had been committed, and to the determination of the world to hold those responsible accountable. They were a symbol of justice, of retribution, and of the world's commitment to ensuring that the horrors of the past would never be forgotten. Executioners. As the sun cast its golden rays over the somber grounds of Stutthof on that historic day in July 1946, the crowd of 200,000 stood in hushed anticipation, their eyes fixed on the gallows. Yet, it was not just the towering structures or the condemned guards that captured their attention, it was the executioners. In a twist of poetic justice, the individuals chosen to carry out the executions were not faceless agents of the state, nor were they hardened executioners who had performed such tasks countless times before. Instead, they were former prisoners of Stutthof, survivors of the very horrors that the condemned had orchestrated. This choice of executioners was a masterstroke of symbolism, a deliberate decision to allow those who had once been victimized to become the instruments of justice. The decision to have former prisoners act as executioners was laden with significance. These were individuals who had endured the unimaginable, starvation, torture, and the constant specter of death. They had witnessed atrocities that defied comprehension and had survived the systematic dehumanization that was the hallmark of the Nazi concentration camps. By choosing these survivors as executioners, the authorities were not only giving them an opportunity to reclaim their dignity but were also making a powerful statement about the resilience of the human spirit. These men and women, who had been stripped of their humanity by their captors, were now standing on the gallows, poised to deliver the final judgment on those who had sought to destroy them. For the executioners themselves, this was a moment of profound significance. The transition from victim to arbiter of justice was not an easy one. Many of them had been ordinary people before the war: teachers, farmers, shopkeepers, people who had never imagined that they would one day be tasked with taking the lives of others. But the war had changed them, forging in them a steely resolve to see justice done. As they stood on the platform, ropes in hand, they were not just performing a duty. They were participating in a ritual of retribution, one that allowed them to confront their tormentors directly and to exact a measure of vengeance for the horrors they had endured. It was a moment of catharsis, where the pain and suffering of the past could be channeled into a single, decisive act. The crowd, too, was acutely aware of the symbolism at play. As they watched the former prisoners take their places on the gallows, they were witnessing more than just an execution. They were witnessing a reversal of power, a moment where the oppressed became the agents of justice. The sight of these survivors, once emaciated and powerless, now standing tall and resolute, was a powerful reminder of the capacity for human resilience and the enduring desire for justice. The crowd's silence was not just a reflection of the gravity of the moment. It was an acknowledgement of the profound significance of what was unfolding before them. This was not just about retribution. It was about reclaiming agency, about asserting that the victims of the Holocaust were not passive figures to be pitied, but individuals who had the right to seek justice on their own terms. The emotional weight of the moment was almost unbearable. For the former prisoners, the act of executing their former captors was fraught with complex emotions. On one hand, there was a deep sense of satisfaction in seeing those who had caused so much pain finally brought to justice. But on the other hand, there was the knowledge that they were taking human lives, a task that, no matter how justified, carried with it a heavy burden. Some of the executioners struggled with this duality, grappling with the ethical and moral implications of their actions. Yet, for many, the opportunity to stand on that platform, to face their former tormentors and deliver the ultimate punishment, was a necessary step in their journey towards healing. As the executions began, the executioners performed their grim task with a sense of solemnity and purpose. Each movement was deliberate, each action a testament to the gravity of the moment. The condemned guards, who had once wielded absolute power within the camp, were now utterly powerless, their lives hanging by a thread, quite literally, in the hands of those they had once brutalized. The reversal of roles was stark and absolute, a powerful demonstration of the idea that justice, though often delayed, would eventually prevail. The executioners, once victims, were now the agents of that justice, delivering it with a steady hand and a clear conscience. The significance of having former prisoners act as executioners extended far beyond the immediate act of punishment. It was a symbolic gesture that underscored the idea that justice must be personal, that those who have suffered most should have a direct hand in the retribution. This was not about revenge, but about restoring a sense of balance to a world that had been thrown into chaos. The executioners were not just avenging their own suffering. They were standing in for the millions who had perished, delivering justice on behalf of all those who could no longer speak for themselves. In this way, their actions were both intensely personal and profoundly communal, a way of ensuring that the voices of the victims would be heard, even in death. The impact of this decision on the broader narrative of justice in the post-war period was immense. The executioners at Stutthof became symbols of the broader struggle for justice in the aftermath of the Holocaust. They represented the idea that justice is not just a matter of legal procedure, but of moral reckoning. By empowering the victims to deliver justice themselves, the authorities were acknowledging the deep wounds that had been inflicted and the need for those wounds to be addressed in a meaningful way. This was not just about punishing the guilty. It was about healing the survivors, about giving them a sense of closure that no trial or verdict could ever fully provide. For the survivors, the act of executing their former captors was a way of reclaiming their humanity. During the war, they had been reduced to numbers, stripped of their identities and treated as less than human. But on that day, they stood as individuals, as human beings with the power to make choices and to shape their own destinies. The executions were a way of asserting their agency, of saying to the world that they were not just passive victims, but active participants in the process of justice. This was a crucial step in the broader process of healing, both for the individual executioners and for the community of survivors as a whole. As the executions drew to a close, the executioners stepped down from the gallows, their task complete. But the significance of what they had done would resonate far beyond that single day. The former prisoners, now executioners, had participated in a moment of profound historical importance, one that would be remembered for generations to come. Their actions had helped to redefine the concept of justice in the post-war world, demonstrating that justice must be both seen and felt, that it must address the deep emotional and psychological wounds left by the Holocaust. The executioners at Stutthof were not just delivering punishment, they were delivering a message to the world, a message that the crimes of the past would not be forgotten, and that those who had suffered most would have a hand in ensuring that justice was done. In the years that followed, the executioners' role at Stutthof would come to be seen as a powerful symbol of the broader struggle for justice in the aftermath of the Holocaust. They embodied the idea that justice is not just about legal retribution, but about moral and emotional reckoning. By empowering the victims to deliver justice themselves, the world was acknowledging the depth of the trauma that had been inflicted and the need for that trauma to be addressed in a meaningful and personal way. The executioners' actions were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the capacity for survival and the enduring desire for justice. The legacy of the executioners at Stutthof is one of both sorrow and hope. It is a reminder of the horrors that humanity is capable of, but also of the strength and resilience that can emerge from those horrors. The executioners, once victims, had risen to become agents of justice, delivering a final, definitive statement on behalf of all those who had suffered and died in the Holocaust. Their actions on that day were a powerful reminder that justice is not just about punishment, but about healing, about restoring a sense of balance to a world that had been thrown into chaos. The executioners at Stutthof will forever be remembered as symbols of the broader struggle for justice in the aftermath of one of the darkest chapters in human history. Strangulation method. The method of execution chosen for the Stutthof guards was as brutal as it was symbolic. Strangulation, by its very nature, is a slow, agonizing process, a far cry from the swift and often clinical methods of execution used in other parts of the world. On that fateful day in July 1946, as the former prisoners took on the role of executioners, the condemned were not merely hanged in the traditional sense. Instead, they were subjected to a form of death that mirrored the suffering they had inflicted upon others, a death that was drawn out, painful, and suffused with the same sense of terror they had once instilled in their victims. The choice of this method was not accidental. It was a deliberate act of retribution, designed to ensure that the condemned felt the full weight of their crimes in their final moments. Strangulation by hanging is a method that has been used throughout history, but the way it was employed at Stutthof was particularly harrowing. Unlike the more common long drop method, which aims to break the neck and bring about a relatively quick death, the executions at Stutthof involved a slow strangulation process. The condemned were lifted just enough to hang by their necks, but not enough to cause a quick death. Instead, they were left to suffocate, their struggles visible to the thousands of onlookers who had gathered to witness their final moments. This method could take up to 20 minutes to bring about death, during which time the condemned would experience intense physical suffering, a suffering that many in the crowd felt was only fitting, given the horrors these individuals had inflicted on others. The decision to use this method was deeply symbolic. It was as if the authorities wanted to ensure that the condemned guards understood, in their final moments, the pain and fear they had caused during their time at Stutthof. The slow, agonizing death they experienced was a mirror of the slow, agonizing deaths that so many prisoners had suffered at their hands. For the executioners, former prisoners who had endured years of brutality, the act of slowly strangling their tormentors was a way of exacting a form of justice that was deeply personal. It was not just about ending the lives of the guilty. It was about making them feel, if only for a few minutes, the same helplessness and despair they had once imposed on others. The choice of strangulation also had a profound psychological impact on the crowd. As the condemned guards struggled for breath, the spectators were confronted with a visceral, undeniable reminder of the suffering that had taken place at Stutthof. This was not a clean, efficient execution. It was a spectacle of suffering, one that forced those who watched to confront the reality of the crimes that had been committed. For many in the crowd, this was a moment of catharsis, a chance to see their tormentors brought low in the most literal sense, to watch as those who had once wielded power over life and death were reduced to gasping, desperate figures, fighting for breath as the noose tightened around their necks. For the condemned, the method of execution must have been terrifying in its deliberateness. There was no quick, merciful end. Instead, there was only the slow, inexorable tightening of the noose, the gradual loss of breath, and the horrifying realization that there would be no reprieve. As they hung there, their bodies twitching and convulsing in the throes of suffocation, they must have been acutely aware of the irony of their situation. Once, they had been the ones inflicting such suffering. Now, they were the ones experiencing it. The slow strangulation was a form of poetic justice, a way of ensuring that the condemned would spend their final moments in the same kind of agony they had so casually inflicted on others. The method also served as a stark reminder of the brutality of the Holocaust. The slow, torturous deaths of the Stutthof guards were a reflection of the slow, torturous deaths that so many had suffered in the camps. It was a way of bringing the horrors of the Holocaust into sharp focus, of reminding the world that the atrocities committed by the Nazis were not just statistics or abstract concepts, but real, physical acts of violence and cruelty. The sight of the condemned guards struggling for breath, their faces contorted in agony, was a powerful visual representation of the suffering that had taken place at Stutthof, a suffering that had been inflicted on countless innocent men, women, and children. The execution method also had a significant impact on the former prisoners who served as executioners. For them, the act of slowly strangling their former captors was a way of reclaiming their power, of turning the tables on those who had once controlled their every move. It was a deeply personal form of justice, one that allowed them to confront their tormentors directly and to ensure that they would not go to their graves without experiencing a fraction of the pain they had caused. This was not just an execution. It was a moment of reckoning, a way for the survivors to take back some measure of control and to assert their own humanity in the face of the dehumanizing brutality they had endured. The slow strangulation also had a lasting impact on the memory of the event. Unlike a quick, clean execution, the drawn-out nature of the strangulation ensured that the deaths of the Stutthof guards would be remembered in vivid detail. The sight of the condemned struggling for breath, their bodies twitching and convulsing, was seared into the minds of those who witnessed it, ensuring that the memory of what had taken place at Stutthof would not fade with time. This was not just about punishing the guilty. It was about ensuring that the world would never forget the horrors of the Holocaust, and that the memory of those who had suffered would be honored through the act of justice. For the spectators, the sight of the condemned guards slowly strangling to death was both horrifying and strangely satisfying. It was a reminder that justice, though often delayed, would eventually be served, and that those who had committed unspeakable crimes would not escape unpunished. The slow, deliberate nature of the execution ensured that the crowd had time to reflect on the significance of the moment, to confront the reality of the suffering that had taken place at Stutthof, and to come to terms with the fact that, while justice could never fully undo the past, it could at least ensure that those responsible were held to account. The method of execution chosen at Stutthof was a stark departure from the more sanitized forms of capital punishment that had become common in the 20th century. It was a reminder that justice is not always clean or easy, but sometimes requires a level of brutality that mirrors the crimes being punished. The slow strangulation of the Stutthof guards was a reflection of the slow, systematic nature of the Holocaust itself, a process of dehumanization and destruction that unfolded over years and that left millions of lives shattered in its wake. By subjecting the condemned to such a slow and painful death, the executioners were not just delivering justice. They were making a statement about the nature of the crimes that had been committed, and the need for those crimes to be confronted in all their brutality. In the end, the method of execution chosen for the Stutthof guards was as much about symbolism as it was about justice. The slow, agonizing deaths they experienced were a reflection of the suffering they had caused, a way of ensuring that they would not go to their graves without fully understanding the weight of their crimes. For the executioners, it was a way of reclaiming their power, of turning the tables on those who had once controlled their lives, and of ensuring that justice was not just done, but seen to be done. For the crowd, it was a moment of catharsis, a chance to see their tormentors brought low, and to witness the final chapter in a story of unimaginable suffering and loss. As the last of the condemned guards finally succumbed to the slow, painful process of strangulation, the crowd began to disperse, their minds heavy with the memory of what they had witnessed. The sight of the guards struggling for breath, their faces twisted in agony, would stay with them for the rest of their lives, a stark reminder of the horrors that had taken place at Stutthof and of the need for justice to be served, no matter how painful or difficult that process might be. The method of execution chosen for the Stutthof guards was a powerful statement about the nature of justice, and about the need to confront the past in all its brutality, in order to ensure that such horrors are never repeated. A disturbing spectacle. The executions at Stutthof on July 4, 1946, were not just a moment of retribution. They were also a public event that drew an enormous crowd, creating an atmosphere that was as unsettling as it was solemn. What made the day even more disturbing was the almost carnival-like atmosphere that permeated the gathering. Amidst the towering gallows and the palpable tension, vendors had set up stalls, selling everything from drinks to snacks, including ice cream. It was a scene that juxtaposed the profound with the profane, a collision of justice and the mundane that spoke volumes about the human capacity to normalize even the most horrific of spectacles. The presence of vendors at the executions was not an anomaly. Rather, it reflected a long history of public executions as a form of mass entertainment. In the centuries prior, executions were often social events, drawing large crowds who would gather to witness justice being served. The stalls and vendors at Stutthof were a continuation of this macabre tradition, providing refreshments to the onlookers as they awaited the grim proceedings. Yet, there was something uniquely unsettling about the combination of ice cream and executions. The sight of people enjoying frozen treats while watching others die was a stark reminder of the banality of evil, a concept that had been brought to the forefront during the Nuremberg trials and was now playing out in real time at Stutthof. For many in the crowd, the availability of ice cream and other snacks was a way of coping with the intense emotions of the day. The sight of the gallows, the knowledge of the crimes committed by those about to be executed, and the anticipation of witnessing their deaths created an atmosphere thick with tension and unease. In such a setting, the act of buying and eating ice cream could be seen as a small comfort, a way to bring a semblance of normalcy to a situation that was anything but normal. Yet, this very act of seeking normalcy in the face of such horror is what made the spectacle so deeply disturbing. It was a reminder of how easily the extraordinary can be made ordinary, and how the most heinous of acts can be witnessed with a dispassionate detachment. The carnival-like atmosphere at the Stutthof executions also highlighted the complex relationship between justice and spectacle. Public executions have always carried an element of performance, a ritualistic enactment of justice that is meant to be witnessed by the masses. But at Stutthof, this performance was marred by the intrusion of everyday life. The vendors selling ice cream and other treats turned the execution into a spectacle that was both solemn and absurd, a moment of historical reckoning that was, at the same time, disturbingly mundane. It was a collision of worlds, the world of justice and the world of commerce, the world of moral accountability and the world of casual consumption. In this collision, the line between the profound and the trivial became blurred, creating a scene that was as surreal as it was unsettling. The juxtaposition of execution and entertainment at Stutthof was a stark reminder of the desensitization that can occur in the face of prolonged exposure to violence. The Holocaust had been an event of unprecedented brutality, and by 1946, the world had become numb to the horrors it had wrought. The presence of ice cream vendors at the executions was a testament to this numbness, a sign that even in the face of justice for the most egregious of crimes, life continued in its banal, everyday forms. The crowd, which had come to witness the final judgment of the Stutthof guards, was also participating in a form of collective dissociation, finding comfort in the familiar rituals of eating and drinking as a way to distance themselves from the horror of what they were about to witness. For the survivors of Stutthof and other concentration camps, the presence of vendors selling ice cream at the executions must have been particularly jarring. These were people who had endured unimaginable suffering, who had seen their loved ones perish in the most brutal of ways. To see others enjoying ice cream while watching their former tormentors face justice may have felt like a trivialization of their pain, a reduction of their suffering to a mere sideshow in a larger spectacle. The contrast between their experiences and the casual consumption of ice cream highlighted the deep disconnect between those who had lived through the horrors of the Holocaust and those who were merely spectators to its aftermath. The ice cream vendors at Stutthof also served as a reminder of the ways in which society can commodify even the most serious of events. In the same way that war can be turned into a game or tragedy into a film, the execution of war criminals was transformed into a public spectacle, complete with snacks and refreshments. This commodification of justice, where the act of witnessing an execution becomes just another form of entertainment, was a disturbing reflection of the times. It showed how even the most solemn of occasions could be stripped of their gravity, turned into something to be consumed alongside a cold treat on a hot day. The unsettling nature of the spectacle at Stutthof was further compounded by the fact that these executions were taking place in a world still reeling from the aftershocks of the war. The boundaries between right and wrong, justice and vengeance, had been blurred by years of conflict and atrocity. In such a world, the presence of ice cream vendors at a mass execution was not just disturbing. It was a reflection of the moral confusion that had taken hold of society. The very act of selling and consuming ice cream in such a context was an implicit acknowledgement of the chaos that had engulfed the world, a chaos in which even the most horrific of events could be reduced to a sideshow, a momentary distraction from the deeper moral and ethical questions that the Holocaust had raised. As the executions at Stutthof came to a close and the crowd began to disperse, the surreal nature of the day lingered in the air. The sight of empty ice cream wrappers littering the ground, mingling with the dust and remnants of the gallows, was a powerful symbol of the day's contradictions. On one hand, justice had been served. The guards of Stutthof had paid the ultimate price for their crimes. But on the other hand, the carnival-like atmosphere, the presence of ice cream vendors, had turned the execution into something else, something that was both unsettling and strangely banal. It was a reminder that even in the face of the most profound events, the everyday world continues to intrude, bringing with it a sense of normalcy that can be both comforting and deeply disturbing. In the years that followed, the spectacle of the Stutthof executions would be remembered not just for the justice that was served, but for the disturbing juxtaposition of horror and the mundane. The presence of ice cream vendors at such a solemn event became a symbol of the ways in which society can normalize even the most horrific of spectacles, turning them into something to be consumed, both literally and figuratively. It was a reminder of the dangers of desensitization, of the ways in which the extraordinary can be rendered ordinary, and of the need to confront the moral implications of turning justice into a public spectacle. The legacy of that day at Stutthof is one of profound contradiction. It was a day when justice was served, when the victims of the Holocaust were avenged, and when the world bore witness to the final judgment of those who had perpetrated some of the most heinous crimes in history. But it was also a day when the boundaries between justice and spectacle, between the profound and the mundane, were blurred in unsettling ways. The presence of ice cream vendors at the executions is a stark reminder of the human capacity to find normalcy even in the face of horror, and of the need to remain vigilant against the forces of desensitization and commodification that can strip even the most serious events of their gravity and meaning. Conclusion. As the final breaths of the condemned faded into the silence of that July evening, the weight of what had transpired at Stutthof settled heavily over the crowd. The towering gallows stood empty, stark reminders of a justice that had been both merciless and necessary. But beyond the execution of the guilty, the day had revealed something deeper about the human condition, a disturbing truth about our capacity to find normalcy even in the face of horror. The sight of ice cream vendors amidst the solemnity of death was not just a trivial detail. It was a chilling symbol of how easily the extraordinary can be diluted by the mundane. This day was a reckoning, not just for the war criminals who met their fate, but for everyone who witnessed the unsettling blend of justice and spectacle. As the crowd slowly dispersed, leaving behind the echoes of strangled breaths and the scent of melting ice cream, the true lesson of Stutthof became clear. In the pursuit of justice, we must be vigilant not to lose sight of the gravity of the past, lest we allow the horrors of history to fade into the banalities of the present. The memory of that day serves as both a warning and a testament, a reminder that justice, while necessary, must be handled with the reverence it deserves, and that the past, no matter how painful, must never be reduced to mere spectacle.